Vintage. Today, we're going to talk about what is vintage and why you should collect it. Or why not? Guys, if you don't already, please hit the like button, follow us. We want to hear your feedback, but I think the big question that we have to answer first is, what is vintage? How do you classify that? What's modern? What is vintage, right? Carlo, why don't you start us off, man? What is vintage?
We're becoming vintage ourselves, but for me, I always go pre-1980. I mean, to me, that's kind of the vintage time. It's typically just Topps products, right? To me, that's kind of the vintage thing. It's becoming a gray area now, right? I mean, is there a certain time period you go back, or is it just a certain year cutoff? To me, I like to think of 80 and prior.
Okay.
Yourself?
I think most people do.
Okay.
Well, I want to hear from Ryan, right? Because
Ryan's like 2002.
I saw a video of him in 2001. He was like 4. So Ryan,
I would say pre-1990. That's
Wow.
vintage to me. Yeah, I would say anything in the 80s is vintage to me. So 90s, I think that's the start of modern, in my opinion. But yeah, I think anything in the 80s is definitely vintage. Yeah,
okay.
that's
What do
really
you
good.
think,
look,
Dave?
I'm going to give you guys the right answer here.
Thank you.
First of all, it's always a moving target, I think. Right now, I think it moved. Obviously, in 1990s, people weren't classifying pre-80. They were probably classifying 60s, right? So I think it moves. But there's a major event with collectibles that I think people can look at and say, okay, I can see that separating, right? Like in the 90s, you've got these refractors, these foil cards. Like those maybe one day will be vintage, but right now I wouldn't put them in
Modern,
there.
yeah.
1989 Upper Deck came out, and that
Changed the
had the
game.
foil on it a little bit. It had the Upper Deck hologram. That was
Glossy,
kind of
better stock. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that was really looked at like the ultra modern set, and the first card in there was Ken Griffey Jr. rookie. So it kind of led that way. At Goldin, we're classifying anything 1987 or prior because I think in '88, same scenario. You had some of the Topps products. You had some of these mass-produced sets like you did in the '80s, but the cutoff there is '87 and prior. For us at Goldin, and I think in general as a collectible, you have to eliminate the late 80s from that vintage period because of the Upper Deck and the insert type products. So we're calling it 87
That's fair.
and earlier. So a Jordan rookie would fall into the vintage category
I
as
think
well.
that makes sense. I mean, I think a staple of, they say it's kind of modern too. I mean, it's one of the most important cards. I think just of any era though. So I don't think it has to be vintage or modern for the Jordan rookie. But yeah, I think that makes sense. 87 and earlier for sure. But I think for even like young guys that are getting into the game, I think vintage is such a great avenue to go into because it's a sure thing. I think in a lot of times where in the modern cards there's so many variations and sets and subsets and inserts and all these other things that I think you're kind of just gambling a lot of the times. Of course, you can buy really great players that you can see the trajectory of their career and where it's going. But when you're thinking of like guys like Babe Ruth or Hank Aaron or Michael Jordan or all these guys, Bill Russells of the world, you know what they've done. They've accomplished everything already. They've proven it time and time again. They've been an icon and idol on the field and off the field. So there's a lot less risk when you're going into that market. So it's kind of like a blue chip stock that you just know over time is just slowly going to increase. It's a nice long-term play.
I like the way that you tied that into like a blue chip stock, right? Because I think in collecting and investing, you have these modern guys that are going to be a lot more volatile. You're going to have your ups and downs. You can cap some upside if you're a really aggressive investor. A lot of guys play the down market, right? They say, okay, this guy's down or he's going down, and they can kind of buy in at the right times. Whereas with the vintage product, these guys have already retired. Some of them are still living. A lot of them are not. You don't have many events that can drive a vintage card too extremely the direction. Obviously, someone passes away, but I think that's what makes it that blue chip. And of course, in any blue chip stock, you have these ups and down periods. They split, they sell, or something like that. Someone approaches a record. You can have these events. But I do agree, in the long haul, if you look at collecting going back 20, 30, 40 years, I mean, it just consistently goes this way, but it's probably not a one-day flip. It might not even be a one-year flip. I mean, what time period would you think vintage is the right time to hold, or is it really what's too soon with vintage? I guess, right?
You
to flip.
guys are missing a point here. The best thing about vintage is it's one card. This is the rookie card. Right. It's not this patch, this auto, this set. Dude, enough of that. This is his rookie card. This is his 1967 Topps rookie card, right? The key with vintage is it's all about eye appeal, right? I mean, how many times people, they go for the card, not the grade when it comes to vintage? And that's the key. I mean, the stuff was overproduced, right? We know that. So what makes it rare? What makes it valuable? The cards that have stood the test of time have gotten through those decades in really good condition.
Yeah.
So that's the key. I mean, you have iconic players, all-time players. They have one rookie card. You don't got to worry about all this other nonsense. You find the best one, and there's so many of these guys that are still undervalued. To me, I look at someone like Tony Gwynn. He's the best hitter I've ever seen, right? His PSA 10 rookie card is still undervalued in my opinion. Who's a better hitter than Tony Gwynn?
Well, maybe like.
Anyway, we don't. Derek Jeter's not. We don't got to get into that. But I'm saying, you still have these guys in vintage that are undervalued, and the key is, time goes by. You look at these all-time lists, these all-time stat lists. These guys are still sitting at the top. So eventually, you got all these guys that you invest in. They come and go, and these guys still stand the test of time. You got to dip into vintage.
I mean, I've definitely noticed, as we're classifying 80s in that category, I've noticed some of the 80s cards, and I realize the pop counts. Population's
Right.
big,
That's
and I
big.
think that the problem is they're a little bit high up. But if you look at the 1986 Topps football set, it's a perfect example because it's a dark border, it's got the green borders, and you start to see these cards.
Jerry Rice.
Jerry Rice, that hit six figures, at one point. It kind of goes back and forth a little bit. But there's other guys in there. There's Reggie White. That was like an $800 card 5 years ago. It's like an $8,000 card now.
But once again, with that, time goes on. All of a sudden, this guy's still sitting at the top of the sack leaderboard, and it's like, wow,
Yeah.
how did I overlook a guy like this? You know what I mean? So
there's definitely good buys in there.
right, you see them pop. Like, look at my guy Moses Malone. We saw his card finally pop because it's like all this time goes by, he's still top 10 in points and rebounds. Time goes by, Tony Gwynn's still going to be one of the best batting averages of all time. The hits are there. Like, you gotta do your homework, yeah. And then you gotta find a good copy, and
All right, so top 3 vintage cards to buy. What are your top 3 right now?
I mean, I need to think about that, David. That's a
All right.
massive question.
Well,
look,
Tony Gwynn, 83 top.
yeah, dude. We'll throw the Tony Gwynn in there. I think
What hasn't matured yet? Like
I know one
what
we
still
love.
has
Go ahead.
room?
The one I know we both love, we talked about many times, the 48 leaf Jackie rookie. I think that is just the design of that card, the vibrant color, the yellow, it just pops. I mean, the center, those cards are hardly ever centered. If you find a nice centered example, I just think it's just a staple. I mean, it's just a staple. You want that card in your collection, and that's one that I've owned in like a lower grade, but I would love to have in a high grade one day.
I'm going to
There's
go.
so many of
I'm
them.
going much
That's
broader.
awesome.
I'm going to go
so
so
many
much
of
broader.
them.
I'm going to cover 2 decades and just pure grades. 1960s and 70s PSA 9s and 10s are going crazy
They are.
right
They
now.
are.
I've seen 1970s PSA 9 cards, 71 tops that are going for 150 grand. That would have been $2,500 5-7 years ago.
it's just, once again, the print defects, they're off center, the dots.
Look at the
It's-
Jordan rookie every time we open up the
Right,
pack. It's
right.
the stickers off center on the back, Yeah.
And it's the other thing people got to realize. They think that they're gonna, they spend all this money on a box and they
Right.
open it up. Like, you're not gonna pull a gem, man. Like,
Yeah.
there's a reason why the gem rates are 20% less on these cards, despite being decades old, because it's hard to gem them. So when you find one, man, it's valuable.
And people weren't prepared they weren't taking
Right.
care of cards like they are today. With all these, top loaders and, the sleeves, and you don't want to touch it with your hands, and wearing gloves. Back then, it was just you liked the card, you collected, you traded with your friends, you went out. Not that I was back there back then, but that's what the olden people
That's what
did.
they were. Did you
That's
read
what they
about
did
it?
back in the day.
You
I
heard
didn't
from
do
Ken
that,
Goldin the story.
But so they put them in bike spokes like you heard. I mean, it's just stuff that you don't even think about. You didn't realize you weren't collecting cards because they were worth a lot of money. You collected cards because you liked that player. You liked interacting with your friends and doing something you all loved. So now it's just so different, where a gem mint of a card or a PSA 9 of a card is not that hard to do because you're taking it right from a pack, and you still might not even get that grade. Whereas back then.
Well, and the grading companies
It's
exist
crazy.
presently, so you can take
Right.
it from the pack to them. You had to wait 30 years
Right.
for a grading company to
Just
exist.
sits in a box.
If you were buying in the 70s. Something also interesting is, we're talking cards here and grades of cards. What do you guys think about like unopened graded packs of cards? Now, I've seen that they don't have like the pop as much like an iconic card, but I've seen like just a very steady increase of those. I feel like if you buy a pack now in 5 years, because with packs, see, with graded cards, the populations increase. But with unopened wax, the populations decrease as people crack and open them.
Good point.
So we're gonna have more PSA 10s in 5 years. We're gonna have less unopened wax.
Yeah.
What I like about the open packs is I like the colors. I like vintage because it just takes you to a certain period in time in history, and the stats on the back of the card, the colors on the card, the uniforms. it just brings you back, and I love the nostalgia part of vintage collecting.
Yeah, and something I notice also with vintage collecting is the high grades, the high population, the low populations.
Yeah.
I feel like in any market, you could get a record on a PSA 9 mantle card, for example. I feel like some of the high grades of the key classics are almost always going to set records every time they come to auction.
Yeah.
I believe I heard a rumor that nobody's ever lost on a T206 Wagner. Every time they come out and sell, they go pretty much for more money.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those type of principles in collecting, you're never going to get burned by a player who, ends up taking steroids or something, coming out like that.
So here's a question: when you think of vintage, what comes to mind, sport-wise? I mean, what's...
Well, I'm always thinking baseball.
Of course.
I'm always going back to the history of baseball. That's
Right.
why I liked collecting
Yep.
baseball. You can go back to the Civil War and talk baseball history. So for
Agreed.
me, that's how I got through college, is honestly relating everything to an event in baseball. I mean, I still have those combos where it's like, oh yeah, 47, Jackie came up, who was the president?
So are we thinking basketball, football, hockey? Is it underrated there? I mean, basketball, you got the 48 Mikan. It's the first important basketball card. You have Bill Russell won 11 titles. No one's ever going to do that again. Will Chamberlain scored 100 points.
Right.
Are those vintage cards undervalued? I mean, we see what these quarterbacks sell for now. Joe
Right.
Montana, PSA 10s, 6 figures, maybe not. Like,
Yeah.
Where's the future?
In relation to the modern player, absolutely undervalued, right? I think in the grand scheme, though, of things, when you look at the Bill Russell rookie, sure, a couple years ago, undervalued
Now
sleeping
it's-
card.
right,
that
right.
card has gone crazy. I mean, we just sold a signed copy for 180 grand. I've seen a lot of these signed rookie copies going crazy lately as well. So signed vintage rookies are key. But yeah, I mean, even soccer, we're seeing all these soccer cards that are coming out from the 40s and 50s.
Pele's and the,
Got that Puskas card that sold for
yeah.
300,000 plus. These Pele's going for $1 million now.
Yeah.
So I think, in all sports, I mean, for me though, it's just baseball is kind of when I think of vintage, I think. But I
100%.
didn't grow up in a different country where I might have been watching football with my grandfather or soccer, or something like that.
And
I got one question for you guys. What's the difference between vintage and old?
Well, I feel like they're definitely
It's the same thing.
similar,
It's
if not
the
the
same
same
thing. Yeah,
for
I think it's the
me.
same thing.
I would call them synonyms. We can start
Okay.
there.
Well, but
like
if I
that.
give you a vintage bottle of wine and I give you an old bottle of wine, isn't there a different connotation to that?
So, I mean, right, when you think of the word vintage, you think of something that, maybe holds value, something that continues to appreciate or stand the test of time. Something old could just be trash that hasn't been thrown out yet. So,
Honestly, it's pretty good. I mean, I thought it was the same, but I'll go with what he said, so I like it.
Thank you.
It's good.
Dave, I think I just stumped you too.
Yeah, look,
I got nothing.
I don't know how to answer that one. I think vintage is kind of old, and old is kind of vintage, so.
I think to sum up vintage, it's exactly what Carlos said earlier, though. There's one rookie card of these guys. It's not, today there's just you could have a rookie card of a player, and there's like 50.
This is the
different
true,
50
is it? Like, I
different
don't-
one-of-ones, and
Come
it's
on.
just, which is fine. It's great and it's exciting, but when you go back to a specific player, someone's favorite player from their past, or your dad's favorite player, whoever the case may be, there's one card, and everyone knows that card is associated with that player. And to me, that's why there's always going to be significant value in vintage. It's that simple.
And there we have
That's
it.
it.
Baby Kroops, the youngest guy on the crew, defining vintage for us all. Guys, man, I love chatting vintage with you. I think there's a million directions we can go. Maybe we'll revisit it again. Let us know, what vintage items are you buying, and what's the difference between vintage and old, because honestly, I still don't know. But guys, go ahead, like the video, subscribe, please share it. Tune in every week. We'll see you guys next week.